Hello and welcome to Preface, coming to you from All 24 News from the heart of Sila, the international book fair here in Algiers. Today we're delving into the history of Algeria, and also we are seeing how the Algerian history is seen in Western or global cultures and literature. Today we have the honor and privilege to receive the Professor James McDougall, a university lecturer or professor from Oxford and also historian at Oxford University, and who's joining us today for more insights about how the Algerian history is seen globally. Welcome, Professor James McDougall.
Thank you.
So, to start with, you have written about the Algerian history and you have maybe widened the image of the Algerian history, and you have also promoted, if we can say that. So, how do you see the Algerian history as a professor, as a historian, as a researcher in history?
I think there are a lot of things to say about that potentially. For someone coming from the Anglophone world, from a background in the United Kingdom, as a linguist, I was trained as a linguist and then as a historian, so I studied French and Arabic. So coming to Algeria was kind of a natural progression for me from my studies linguistically. I think one of the things that draws people to Algeria is the way that its history is often misconstrued or misrepresented or understood only in quite simple terms, to do with armed struggle, to do with colonialism, to do with the French colonial period in particular. The War of Independence is something that people are aware of, even if they don't know very much about it. The deeper, wider cultural and social histories of Algeria are not so well known. And that was really what drew me to the country. The sense that this was a place that a lot of people, especially in France, think they know something about. Especially in France, a country that people think they can talk about quite easily because it's part of their own history often. I'd spent a lot of time living in France. Yeah, I mean, there's a common history and also a very conflictual history, one that's also used politically for particular political purposes in France, which is very present in the French public sphere. Absolutely. That's something that I observed when I was living in France, but which is also very poorly understood more broadly, especially in the Anglophone world, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, and that's something I wanted to be involved in.
And in your previous book, A History of Algeria, you placed the Algerian society as in the heart of the narrative of Algeria, not only seen as a backdrop of the French colonization. Exactly. What motivates you to adopt such an approach to speak about the Algerian history?
Well, I mean, partly what I just said, I suppose, in that when people think about Algeria, especially in the Anglophone world, what we know is Fanon, and maybe the Julie Pontecorvo film, The Battle of Algiers, okay, which is a huge cinematic kind of classic for Anglophone people watching films, thinking about North Africa, thinking about the Middle East, thinking about decolonization. And French colonialism is often the reason people get interested in Algeria. I wanted to change that, and I wanted to spend some time thinking about what are the deeper patterns of the way that Algerian society has related to the state in Algeria, the way that Algerian society has constructed itself and its own narratives of its history, rather than simply look at it as a kind of case study of violence, you know, which is what French colonialism fundamentally was. And to think about the ways that Algerian society over a very long period of time, from the 16th century, from the arrival of the Ottomans, which is where my book starts in 1516, through to the early 21st century, and the book finishes in 2016, so it's a 500-year span of time that I'm looking at, how Algerian society is constantly recreating itself over that period of time, and really to place the agency for that with Algerians themselves, with ordinary Algerians wherever they live in the country, rather than with a kind of external force that just kind of comes in and crushes people. I think that's a vision of Algeria that we often have, that it's simply a place that is victimized by outside forces, and I think that's not true. I think there's much more going on in Algerian history from the interior, and that's what I was trying to get at with that book. So that's why it's a social history much more than a political one, in fact.
Yeah, Algeria has been seen as a hub for revolutions, for also liberation movements around the world. We have seen many books, many historians talking about Black Panthers present in Algeria, where we have seen the history of Frantz Fanon in Algeria, and many other revolutions present here or represented here in Algeria. So how do you see Algeria, or to what extent Algeria was a hub for these liberation movements?
So obviously in the 60s and 70s, that's an immensely significant part of why Algeria becomes an iconic country of the global south, where the Algerian experience becomes so important for so many people and attracts so much attention. You know, I mean, all over the global south, and also in the United States for movements like the Black Panthers, also for, you know, for Palestinians, for Egyptians, for Yemenis, for people in Mozambique, for people in South Africa. You know, Nelson Mandela writes about how he spent time with the Army of National Liberation on the border, watching what was going on across the border, imagining what that would be like for the South African armed struggle itself. So, you know, I mean, there's no doubt that, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, that's an aspect of Algeria's history that is incredibly important, very important. And of course, I deal with that in the book as well. And that's one of the things that many historians have tended to look at when looking at Algeria. They're interested especially in that particular moment of Algeria's history. You know, I would want to say, I suppose, that that's part of, again, a much longer history of Algeria's engagement with the world around it, with Africa, with the Mediterranean, with the Arab world, with the larger Muslim world, with Europe, and that, again, you know, that's a really important moment in Algeria's history. But Algeria's history shouldn't be just reduced to that one kind of iconic, representative kind of spectacle, even though obviously, you know, at that particular moment of time, especially in the middle of the 1960s, you know, it was tremendously important.
So in your maybe one of the first books you wrote about the Algerian history, which was History and the Culture of Nationalism in Algeria, you examined how history itself was constructed in Algeria. Also, you mentioned that it was under the colonial rule, and then during the nationalist era. How do you see the relationship between how we write history and how Algeria defines its identity and diplomacy globally?
So I guess there are two parts to that question. One is to do with identity, and let me talk about that first, then we can come back to diplomacy and global kind of positioning. I mean, so my first book, which was based on my PhD research, was about the way that Algerian, especially Arabic-speaking, Arabic-writing intellectuals who belong to the movement of the ulama, so the Islahist or religious reformist movement in the early 20th century, from about the 1920s through the 1940s, really began to write a national history of Algeria in Arabic for their own compatriots, constructing a vision of a national community and of a national past which preceded French colonialism, right? So this is a way of writing a national history which obviously contributes in some ways politically to the development of the national movement, although very often politically they were at odds with other parts of the national movement, especially the followers of Messali Hajj, with whom they were not necessarily in agreement all of the time. You know, these people spent quite a lot of time fighting each other, at least intellectually, if not actually politically.
They were in a disagreement.
Yeah, there were a lot of disagreements.
Yeah,
and of course,
but the goal was the same.
The goal was the same. The goal in terms of independence and the reacquisition of Algerian sovereignty, for sure, absolutely, was exactly the same. But they were very different. You know, in the 1920s and 30s, people argue very vigorously about how to achieve that.
But that's natural.
Which is absolutely normal, yeah, of course. And you know, that it's important also. One of the points of my book, I guess, was to show the extent to which nationalist politics is about constructing a kind of terrain of struggle in which Algerians themselves are engaged before they start fighting the French, right? So I mean, that's very important. Yeah. And I think the component parts, if you like, of Algerian culture or Algerian identity, if you want to talk about it like that, you know, really begin to be worked out in this period. It's not that obviously they exist for a very long time before then, but they begin to be worked out as part of a kind of political project in the modern sense, in an organized political way that connects with kind of mass mobilization of the people as a political force, yeah, beginning in this period in the 1920s and 1930s. So that's what that book was about.
So at a gatherings such as Sila and the public, intellectuals and authors, also historians, are gathered within the theme of dialogue. So how do you see the role of this kind of intellectuals meeting to shape the collective memory?
Gosh, so I mean, I think events like this are obviously fantastic. There are enormous numbers of people outside, people coming and looking at books. To begin with, as someone who writes books, I think it's great when people buy and read books. So just the idea of getting involved in reading and discussing and being around physical books, especially now, when there's so much competition for people's attention from material and information online, to actually have physical books being discussed and talked about and have that as a kind of focus of attention, I think is tremendously good. Publishing in Algeria is extraordinary now. It's extraordinarily vast, extraordinarily rich and diverse. I think that's really something to celebrate enormously. I think it's one of the ways in which Algeria engages in a very open and productive way with the world, around it and with other countries. Obviously, as we know, the Sila is, I think, the biggest book fair in Africa, maybe the biggest book fair in the Arab world as well. So it's a really major cultural event, and I think there's, to the extent that it's possible for historians actually to be present and to be engaging in, open, interesting debate around ideas and about the work that they're doing, so much the better. And if that can involve a larger public, I think that's fantastic. There are all kinds of barriers to that, obviously linguistic and in terms of access and in terms of how good we are at communicating our own ideas, which is often a problem for us too. But I think the more we can do that, the better the chances are that we can actually have larger, open public debates about these issues.
Yeah. So many points or many steps of the Algerian Revolution are still the center or the central part of the Algerian national identity.
Of course.
If we talk about the Salam Conference, the declaration of the revolution in the 1st of November, and also the Evian Accords. So how do you see that narrative intersecting with regional memories?
So that's a really interesting question. I think it's something that Algerian historians actually have been working on for a long time as well. For quite a long time in Algeria, there was a concern, I guess, to present a single narrative of the revolution and a single narrative of the nation and a single kind of political project, which is completely understandable and entirely normal when you see, the way that the state was being constructed in the 1960s and 1970s. And integrating regional diversities and the variety of experiences that go to make up the country and that went to make up the revolution into that narrative has been I think really important. We've just had this the celebration of the commemoration of November the 1st, which is still a tremendously important date for Algerian history and a sense of Algerian community. I think that is something that is emotionally felt among ordinary Algerians. It's a thing that people recognize as being an important moment of kind of solidarity. And at the same time, it's been much easier, I guess, in recent times to see the variety of ways in which different experiences of the revolution and different cultural and political and social aspects of life in Algeria, both before, during and after the revolution, have existed alongside each other. In relation to the state as a kind of central mediating force, without necessarily simply being subsumed by the state. I think that's quite important, and we see a certain kind of maturing of Algerian historiography in the sense that those things are more vividly visible now, maybe than they were, say, 40 years ago.
If we talk about Algeria today as a diplomatic, let's say a diplomatic voice, or maybe it is playing an important role in voicing or amplifying the voices of anti-colonialism around the world and mainly in Africa, the Mediterranean region, the Islamic region, and all these cultures or parts of history which intersect in Algeria. So how do you assess, or how can we can you as historians support this diplomacy?
So, as a foreigner, I wouldn't want to comment on Algerian foreign policy, which is not my area of specialism. But I think, again, this goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier in terms of the significance of Algeria as a kind of symbolic hub and an inspiration, right, for liberation movements around the world.
And also as a key player.
And as a player since then. So obviously there are particular causes or particular kind of moments that one might identify, in Africa right now in terms of the Western Sahara, the Sahrawi question, in terms of the Middle East, in terms of Palestine, very obviously, in the genocide in Gaza, which has been going on now for 2 years, where, I think people do look to Algeria for leadership. At a time when often elsewhere in the Arab world or in Africa leadership is lacking or is vulnerable or is fragile or is, as we see in the Sahel, is facing challenges. And, there's no doubt that, again, historically Algeria has played an immensely significant role as a regional power in West Africa, in the Sahel, in the Maghreb, in the Mediterranean region more generally, and indeed in Africa and in the Middle East. Algiers has been a place where different conflicting parties have often been able to come to find agreements, right? Look at the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Where was that war concluded? It was concluded not in Addis Ababa or in Cairo, but in Algiers, with the Algiers Accords, right? So, there are lots of ways in which Algeria historically has been and continues to be looked to, I think, as a force that needs to be present on the regional stage. And I think one of the geostrategic advantages that Algeria has, of course, is precisely this position that it enjoys, right, at the junction of Africa, Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Arab world. That's a position which is often an uncomfortable one, has been an uncomfortable one for much of the past 25 years because of global geopolitics, but also a place that puts Algeria in a really significant position if it can leverage that position in a positive way.
So one of the themes of Sila is dialogue. If we go back to the main event nowadays in Algiers, dialogue between authors, between historians, between intellectuals. So how do you assess the place of Algerian historical scholarship in the global book world? And are there any barriers in translation, in narrative framing, or even in audience?
So I think there are. It's paradoxical, I guess. That the great thing about publishing and the great thing about books, as I said before, is it brings people together around a single object that can be the object of discussion, right? And it does so in a way that often can get past some of the the echo chambers that we have online, or the communities that kind of tend to agglomerate around a single narrative in online communities now, which is one of the problems that we have in the polarization of politics in Europe and the United States. And dialogue, obviously, around the subject that authors write about is something that authors want to be engaged in. We want to write books because we want to engage in conversation with readers, right? And at the same time, paradoxically, that is tremendously difficult because there are a lot of barriers, right? There are barriers to accessibility, to in particular the costs of translation. The costs of publishing, of course, have gone up. It's expensive to buy books. It's expensive to get books across national frontiers. It's difficult to get translation rights for so many books. For my books that come out in English are not available in French or in Arabic. I wish they were, but that's difficult to do. Books that are published in Algeria in Arabic are often not available outside of the country. So it's difficult, creating a community around books is really important, and that's really what books are for. But of course there is an economy around that makes it a difficult thing to do. So the cost of translation, the cost of being able to sell and to make books pay, and to for it to be a viable commercial enterprise for a publisher is tremendously challenging right now.
Exactly, and especially when it came to the last inflation,
of course,
backdrops.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, economic conditions are not
very
favourable, and so I think publishers who are facing these difficulties should be supported as much as possible. And obviously, as an author, I kind of I wish we could all do more to make those things easier to manage.
And hopefully, we can reach a certain point where translation, publishing can become more accessible to audiences, especially when it comes to history. So, as an experimented historian, as someone who spent like a long time of his life dedicated long nights, maybe years of your life to history. How can you, or how do you believe younger researchers in history, or maybe authors, historians, how can we, or can you, historians, direct them, or maybe help them reach a certain point where history is shown in the right way?
Gosh, so I mean, we were just talking about barriers to accessibility to books, right, and to reading, and of course there are barriers to entering the historical profession as well, right, and or even to engaging with history as an informed citizen, right, and I suppose our responsibility as historians or as authors is to communicate as clearly as we can, to write as well as we can, to be as honest in our research as we can be, to make it sure that we engage with all the sources at our disposal. Accessibility of sources and archives, of course, is an issue as well. So to encourage younger colleagues, you know, entering historical study is one of the things I love about working in universities. You know, I mean, I've had a lot of doctoral students myself who've gone on to become professional historians in lots of different countries, and I'm always struck by the energy, the curiosity, the questions that people bring to the subject themselves, and really our job is only to try to make conditions as manageable as possible. You know, the economic climate being what it is, getting jobs in universities now is extremely difficult. There are universities in the UK and in the United States even that are closing departments of the humanities and social sciences. These are challenges that we're all facing. There's a very common narrative now that, you know, work on history or in humanities and social sciences is somehow not valuable economically, which is of course not true, but it's a narrative that one often hears from politicians on the right in our own countries, and, you know, trying to make conditions manageable for the next generation is a huge challenge in itself, and I think that's maybe our primary responsibility.
So you have talked about curiosity, you have talked about being triggered into history and being attracted into history.
Yeah.
Don't you think that sometimes maybe history or searching in history and the cultural or the, let's say, the origin or the background creates some kind of bias when writing history?
I mean, yes, of course. Everyone who comes into historical study is necessarily themselves, you know, a historically located individual, right? Speaking a certain language, having a certain historical consciousness themselves, having a certain set of ideas about, you know, what makes the world work and who they are and their own identity and how they come to questions. You know, you ask particular questions as a historian because of your own political engagements or your own personal experience, maybe, or the things you happen to be interested in. That's, on the one hand, one of the great richnesses of the subject, I think, that everyone who comes to it does so in their own way. No two people will write on the same subject in exactly the same way. There will always be space for debate and for openness and for divergence of opinion, and that's very good. I think that's a very good democratizing force in the discipline itself, right? You can't have a single historical truth that everyone will subscribe to. That simply doesn't exist. And so I think personal situatedness, if you like, or the location of the historian relative to what they're studying is an inevitability and also an advantage. Now, on the other hand, of course, it can become a liability, right? If your own preconceptions or your own linguistic limitations or the limitations of the sources to which you have access or the political program that you bring to your work is directing you in a particular way and making you see only certain narratives and avoid others, right? Or take account of certain sources of evidence and ignore others, or look only for the kinds of argument that are going to prove what you think you already know. And of course, you know, in the history of colonialism, we've seen that a lot. You know that's something that exists in this field. So that's always a problem. But I think professional historical training and just a basic kind of sense of historical ethics as a researcher can guard against that quite effectively. And the other way of guarding against it, of course, is to come together and talk. So one person is never able to just sit in their own set of prejudices, but they're always challenged to come up with the evidence, behind the arguments that they're producing.
As a final point, what do you believe should be the next chapter in how Algeria delivers its picture or tells its story?
I'm not sure foreigners should tell Algerians how to tell their story. I think.
But from a historian
I
perspective.
understand. No, the question's a good one. But it's important to think about what our respective roles are. I think in this question. I mean, I think every country's history is a subject of interest for people from every country. I mean, I think anyone can work on or look at the history of any country. I think that's really actually very important. That there's again, we've talked a lot about openness and dialogue, right? I mean, I think it's important that it's possible for British or American or French or whatever Italian scholars to come to Algeria and work on Algerian history, because Algeria is an important country and we need to understand it better. And at the same time, I think Algeria and younger Algerian scholars or Algerian historians or Algerian university students, have to find their own ways and ask their own questions and find their own curiosity about the things in the national past that most speak to them, and speak to the ways that they want to see the country develop in the future. History is, we talk about the past, right? But history is always being made with a view towards the future.
Exactly. It is the basis for the future.
Yeah, of course. And I think thinking about, what kind of country do you want to build going forward in the 21st century, will influence what kind of historical questions people want to ask, and I'm excited to see what that might be.
Thank you so much, Professor James McDougall, for your insights, for your thorough analysis on history. We have reached the end of our program. Thank you, dear viewers. You have been with me, Usama Ayadi, interviewing Professor James McDougall, historian at Oxford University. Please do take care. Till next time.